Hello and welcome to Oregon News. I'm Deuce Whitson. This is a special edition of our regularly scheduled program titled Journalism Today, a Matter of Trust. In a country where fake news and alternative facts have become part of the daily lexicon, it's hard to identify fact, truth, or even what's real. Today we'll be talking to a variety of experts to talk about how you can identify news you can trust. Not all reporters are created equal, but under the First Amendment, it appears that way. Our Wendy Jones takes a look into the nature of a free and enlightened press.
Freedom of the press has long been a cherished pillar of the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment. When it comes to journalism, the amendment is simple. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. That Constitution amendment has provided a level of protection for journalists, even when they have published inconvenient and unpopular information. Thomas Jefferson was known for hating the press, but he stated, quote, "If I had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter," end quote. Tim Gleason teaches communication law at the University of Oregon. He stresses journalists and all other citizens need to speak responsibly.
This world, and given technology and what we can do, that everyone can be a journalist. Well, that's true. Everyone can be a journalist, but everyone isn't a journalist. And journalists need to be very careful and very protective of the craft and of what it means to be an ethical journalist.
All the amendment says is Congress shall make no law. That doesn't guarantee journalists are going to do a good job.
The journalism you do, the more you erode the power of free speech.
Now, journalists aren't perfect, and they do make errors. So most mainstream journalists belong to organizations with standards to hold the profession accountable. The Radio, Television, Digital News Association, and the Society of Professional Journalists both have published codes of ethics. The reader or viewer can expect journalists to follow these codes. But there is no guarantee of that, and news consumers need to step out of their comfort zones and cross-check stories by comparing different news sources. Viewers play an active role in making sure the stories they hear are truthful. Ethics are what distinguish journalists from everyone else with a pen. According to the Society of Professional Journalists, public enlightenment is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. Ethical journalism strives to ensure the free exchange of information that is accurate, fair, and thorough. Ethical journalists should be honest when gathering, reporting, and interpreting information and keep their own opinions out of the story.
Provide the public with reliable, truthful information, even when it's hard to do so.
That also means presenting all facts, because omitting information can be just as bad as being inaccurate. According to the National Press Photographers Association, the organization of visual journalists, they believe reporters and photographers should treat all subjects with respect and dignity, give special consideration to vulnerable subjects, and compassion to victims of crime to tragedy. In other words, intrude on private moments of grief only when the public has an overriding and justifiable need to see. Being an ethical journalist doesn't fall under the First Amendment, but it is something most reputable journalists strive for. Credibility is all we have as journalists. Lose that and we've lost the profession. The First Amendment carves the path for all journalists walk, but the code of ethics are the rails that keep them on track. Gleason says he thinks the resolution is,
we need to build a culture in which there's less shouting and there's more conversation.
Bottom line, viewers and readers need to challenge themselves by looking at things they disagree with. And journalists
need to hold each other accountable. And the public also needs to play, and I think, a much stronger role in all of this. And that's hard. I mean, we're in a polarized time. People are all too many, and this is not just people, people on all spectrums or all parts of the political spectrum live in bubbles.
For Oregon News, Wendy Jones.
In a modern media climate, it's hard to tell the difference between what is fake and what is real. Cale Newton and Paige Harkless talk about how you can't always trust people like me when you see them on feeds like this.
You've probably been hearing a lot about fake news lately.
It seems as if no matter where you turn, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, print, or TV news, critics say you'll find stories that can't or shouldn't be trusted. Sometimes it's hard to tell what is trustworthy journalism.
Recently, the news landscape has changed dramatically.
First, the basics. What is fake news? Put simply, when a reporter or news organization intentionally misreports or fabricates aspects of a story. We've broken this phenomenon into two categories.
1. Biased or inaccurately reported journalism. Think bad reporter.
And purely fabricated stories. Think liar. We're going to look at a few different examples in order to illustrate these categories.
Recent coverage of the ongoing investigation headed by Robert Mueller into whether or not President Trump obstructed justice in his firing of former FBI Director James Comey. Depending on which channel you watch, you could be getting an entirely different story on what is happening.
The special counsel, Robert Mueller, is investigating President Trump for possible obstruction of justice.
That the President of the United States is the subject of a criminal investigation by the FBI.
Possible obstruction of justice by the president. Now, you've got to keep in mind the same newspaper, the Washington Post, that has been wrong time and time again.
The bottom line here is that the same story can be reported in vastly different ways with widely varying conclusions.
Now, let's look at an entirely different breed of misleading news that has become increasingly prevalent over the last year or so: fake news. This term is a tricky one to pin down and define, but for our purposes, it means entirely fabricated stories produced to achieve a specific result. For instance, the story surrounding the death of former Democratic National Committee staffer Seth Rich serves as a pertinent case study of this phenomenon.
Rich was killed last July in what DC Metro Police have described as a robbery gone wrong.
Now, that would make it a fairly routine murder, until some conservative reporters, most notably Fox News pundit Sean Hannity, began to speculate on the story.
In what amounted to little more than a conspiracy theory, Hannity and others openly suggested on air that Rich was killed as part of a cover-up for an inside job in the DNC's hacking of the computer files in 2016.
Now, this claim has been repeatedly and soundly debunked on multiple levels.
Fox News eventually retracted the story on the subject. Some advertisers pulled support from Hannity's show, but Hannity himself at this point has offered no retraction. But stories like these have a lot of buzz around them.
They spread like wildfire through social media and erode the public's trust.
When fake news is published on sites such as Facebook or Twitter, it can easily pass as the truth to the untrained eye. A casual search for information may return malicious results and misinformation. Stacey Ishmael is the Knight Fellow at Stanford and former BuzzFeed News managing editor for mobile. She says these days you can't tell someone to just Google it, because there are a lot of sites out there trying to fool you.
Telling somebody to just Google something assumes that they have like some subject matter expertise in the thing that they're looking for. That if they're looking up historical facts, they have some context that means like that country is not a real country, like, you know, or it wasn't at the time of this story. So there's a lot of embedded assumptions around knowledge.
So how can you tell the good sites from the bad? Healthy suspicion is a start. If it seems too terrible, too good, too awful, it probably is. So do more research.
Also, developers in the tech world are trying to help.
Right. They're working on apps that make it clear what's news, what's opinion, or advertising, or content someone's paid to have on the website. The best thing you can do as a news consumer is expose yourself to authors and outlets with differing viewpoints from your own. But when something is proven to be untrue or is unsubstantiated, just ignore it.
Here's something that's not fake news. I'm Cal Newton, that's Paige Harkless, and this is Oregon News.
In the year 2017, we are surrounded by media, from TVs and posters and whatever on Facebook. But how much of it is news and how much of it is opinion? Hannah Vetrano and Kendra Fagerberg discusses that.
When you think of the news, you may think of ABC Nightly or Fox or even the New York Times. Media Studies professor Christopher Chavez says all these sources have a vital purpose.
With journalism, the idea is to get people to maybe think more cognitively or more dispassionately.
But different news operations will often choose different information to include in their coverage, which means not all journalism is created equal. That's why Chavez says it's important to look at both sides of a story and consume information from multiple sources to figure out what's real.
Look at multiple different sources. And I think that's good, probably true for myself, like to look at sources that maybe come at a same issue from a couple of different vantage points. So that way you can kind of assess, okay, is this really a different take on the same event, or is there some sort of consistency in the way that it's being reported?
Not only should you look at multiple sides of the story, but also consider sources, asking yourself, are they credible?
An example of this is the way different news organizations characterize the recent testimony given by James Comey to the Senate Intelligence Committee. On MSNBC, the headline read, "Comey to Trump, release all the tapes."
They could flip him because they had him caught on something he dishonestly answered, but he wasn't central, it seemed, to the Russian thing.
The CNN headline reads, "Trump, some things leaker Comey said weren't true."
And you seem to be hinting that there are recordings of those conversations.
I'm not hinting anything. I'll tell you about it over a very short period of time.
While the Fox News headline reads, "President Trump warns Comey against leaking," suggests possible tapes of conversations.
To talk like, well, you better watch out, or you might get whacked by tapes, it was self-inflicted and unnecessary.
The ABC News headline said, "Nothing further to add on Trump tweet that Comey conversations possibly taped."
That the White House would not speak any further on it, neither confirming or denying the idea that there are listening devices that are put there by the president or someone else in and around the Oval Office at the White House.
These are examples of news organizations covering one topic from different angles.
Now let's take a look at other news shows that take sides. In this instance, the show is about Obamacare. From MSNBC, the Rachel Maddow Show takes a stand for the importance of the Affordable Health Care Act.
To get through, they need to pass this if they're going to repeal Obamacare. They're going to take away this program that provides tens of millions of Americans with their health insurance.
The Sean Hannity Show on Fox News is a little different.
Obamacare must be, under all circumstances, completely repealed.
Professor Seth Lewis says people tune into opinion shows because it reinforces their beliefs.
People probably turn to Hannity not so much for original reporting as much as confirmation that what they believe is okay.
Not only are Americans watching more television than ever before, they're also watching a wider variety of sources, making it sometimes hard to differentiate between entertainment and news. Professor Chavez believes the majority of Americans watch news coverage that is handed to them instead of searching for information on their own.
If it comes through the television or if it comes through, if it's on a magazine, for many people that's enough. That's the barrier of entry, so it must be credible.
Now we haven't even started to talk about satire. Lewis says satire is
taking something that people can recognize and then sort of playing with it in a way that allows them to recognize that you're not necessarily being serious.
Lewis believes it is hard for news consumers to differentiate real and fake news because there's an overabundance of information being provided through screens and social media.
The number of sources has exploded. The amount of time we spend with media has gone up. And so we now face a filtering problem of dealing with too much information, of overload.
Lewis says when watching news, people should always be somewhat skeptical about the information they're receiving. What Chavez looks for as a news consumer is a journalism source that wants to stay in business.
Okay, does it have a brand that has an equity? That if they tell a story or make a misstep, that it's going to hurt the brand in some sort of way. And so I think it causes them to be a little bit more diligent in their reporting.
Additionally, audience members should check out and compare multiple media sources so they can separate facts from opinions.
For Oregon Extra, I'm Kendra Fagerberg.
And I'm Hannah Vetrano.
A common complaint about journalism is that some news stories are sensationalized. Say this volcano is fear, and this vinegar are words like may, could, and might. You pour into the volcano, and you get a reaction. Bailey Mulder and Chloe Spencer have more on fear-mongering and word choice.
We've all seen them. Dramatized headlines and sensationalized news stories. And drama can contribute to bias, even if it's not intentional. Frequently, word choice and the use of metaphors play into how a story is viewed. Ethics professor Tom Bivens says word choice is critically important in writing a story.
The best journalists choose their words very carefully, and if they really want to say something, and if they really have a point of view, then they choose the words that express that point of view. If they want to be neutral, it's actually much harder to pick words.
Word choice is especially critical in framing opinions.
Everything you say affects the way people understand everything, no matter how objective you try to be.
He says that equivocators like may, might, and could are dangerous in the field of journalism because they beat around the bush.
Those words allow us to make statements where either we're not quite sure, so we're qualifying the answer, or we are sure but we don't want you to know yet. And one of those is deceptive. It's not an outright lie because that's what qualifiers do, but it is more deceptive.
George Lakoff, director for the Center of Neural Mind and Society, studied President Trump's tweets. He found that Trump uses a four-pronged attack in his tweets. He attacks, frames the issue, deflects attention from something else that is happening, and sends up a trial balloon of something people might want to attack. Bivens says the way President Trump speaks is unlike any other United States president we have had, and it produces a shock factor for Americans and the rest of the world.
He's locked into a pattern of communication that is not particularly informative. It equivocates. It says one thing and then 5 minutes later says something else. That doesn't exactly instill trust in people.
Mark Johnson, the Philip H. Knight Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences, wrote a book with Lakoff called Metaphors We Live By, which started a field of study. Through his research, Johnson determined that humans use metaphors to understand their world, including morality, politics, and religion.
And the metaphors, what they do is they take our body-based meaning, like the thing, like things that happen in vision or touch, and they appropriate that knowledge to understand abstractions like how the mind works.
He says metaphors are well integrated into our minds and speech patterns. One example, using vision terms to express understanding of an idea. You might say something like,
"Oh, I see what you mean.
That was an illuminating idea."
Or if you're confused, you might ask,
"Could you shed some light on the subject?"
See, we don't think or express ourselves on a purely literal level.
The idea was that metaphors are not just matters of words. The metaphors are the deepest conceptual structures we have.
So how can metaphors affect opinions? Johnson took a look at how metaphors are used to express morality in different political orientations.
People tend to frame their moral understanding in terms like, the family. So since we learn our early morality in some kind of family situation.
Okay, so how do all of these theories influence people to frame situations? Johnson used the example of tax relief, which conservatives speak about a lot.
The phrase tax relief does what? It frames the notion of taxes in a certain way. It gets a relief frame. And what's the relief frame? Well, that's when you've got an affliction and you deserve and need relief from it.
Whereas liberals?
Progressives need to frame taxation in a different way to affect your perception. So they need to say, no, taxation is about doing our fair share to support and nurture.
Metaphors also play a role in the way we frame stories. If journalists aren't careful with their choice of words and how they frame stories, they can contribute to unnecessary fear. One former journalist, David Ropeek, says the media needs to do a better job of communicating. Ropeek researches risk communication at Harvard University. He teaches reporters to write responsibly about risk. That's important because research shows that news can amplify someone's fear. For example, the media tends to exaggerate the extent and frequency of violent crimes. Crime rates have fallen since the early 1990s, but polls indicate that Americans feel the crime rate is rising. Ropeek says risk stories are enticing for journalists.
And it turns out that all the risk perception characteristics that to you and I make a risk feel scarier, to a journalist identify a better story.
So what advice does Ropeek have for viewers?
Take any journalistic version of a risk story with a few grains of salt.
But more importantly, if you think a story is being sensationalized, the best thing Ropeek says you can do is get more information.
Instead of instinctively just taking the first version because that's easier, you're making the mental effort to let more information in.
Viewers, be proactive about watching. If you're concerned about a story, look up more information.
Because journalists could, may, or might be wrong. For Oregon Extra, I'm Bailey Mulder.
And I'm Chloe Spencer.
When you think of journalism, you probably only think about words and information, but the way those messages are delivered to you can have a huge impact on your perception. Reporters Gabby Renda and Mitch Reams talk about lighting, framing, and deceptive filming practices.
Here, the standard interview, also known as the neutral shot, puts the camera at eye level, uses bright lighting, and frames the subject on one side of the screen.
This framing is called the rule of thirds and is used because it's aesthetically pleasing to the viewer. But photographers can also shoot images that are far from neutral, shots that carry an emotional message. Dan Morrison is a University of Oregon professor with more than 30 years experience as a professional photographer.
If you shoot where the camera is looking down on the subject, that subject appears weak and submissive. If you shoot from a low angle and shoot up, that person appears very, very dominant and very authoritarian.
But also, the shot doesn't have to move. Lighting alone is enough to shift the perception of a shot. University of Oregon lighting instructor Leonard Henderson says news should stick to the basics when reporting on non-feature style pieces.
Your regular news story has nothing to do with shadows. It has nothing to do with being creative usually. It's get the story. It's about the story.
It's also important to pay attention to how people, especially politicians, use strategic lighting and angles to help push their agenda.
I think as soon as you see shadows, now you know that they're trying to do a creative piece.
For example, during the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump's ad shows Clinton in dark lighting while talking about her, but then shows himself at the end in a well-lit and framed photo. But Clinton does the same in her ad. She showcases children in a dark room as Trump speaks, but then suddenly other children are shown in well-lit rooms when she comes on the screen. Not everyone is paying attention, and that can add up to an unspoken bias.
Otherwise, if you try to create your own mood and feeling, now people will either see that person or go there and go, it doesn't look anything like what I saw on that video piece.
News organizations are supposed to show all candidates in the same framing and lighting. The same rules are supposed to apply to still photography. But look at this 1994 cover photo. Time magazine darkened O.J. Simpson's mugshot noticeably. Some critics called it racist, especially when compared to the brighter version of the photo used by Newsweek on its cover. These two examples show how much lighting, framing, and angles can change the way a subject is perceived by the audience.
You've probably heard the phrase, "Oh yeah, says who?" Well, we all want to know, and journalists are supposed to say where they get their information from. It's called attribution. Journalists have to do that in order to remain credible, and news consumers want to know so that way they know where their information is coming from. So we're going to attribute the story to Kate Houston and Armin Araradian.
How do you know if the story you are reading or watching is credible? That's a problem many news consumers are struggling with today. As much as we'd love to trust every journalist out there, you need to have a healthy dose of skepticism and be critical of what you're reading. It isn't just about what was said, it's also about who said it and why. It's not enough for journalists to attribute a source anymore. They can't put their credibility on the line for anyone because everyone has an agenda. Senior journalism instructor at the University of Oregon, Lisa Hayamoto, says it's important to truly know who your sources are and what their motivation is.
We call it the big T, little t truth. So the little t truth is like, yes, that was, accurate. And yes, that person is a person who said that thing. But the big T truth is not true. So, like a story on, changes in the Antarctic ice shelf, for example, where there's a scientist interviewed, and the scientist has spent his whole career working for oil companies and has this kind of crackpot theory about, climate change that is not borne out by any other scientists. So yes, it's attributed, right? That's a real person who really does believe those things, who really did say them, but it's irresponsible sort of in the larger sense.
Hayamoto says misleading news consumers is a larger problem than fake news, and this is largely due to the fact that people are consuming news through social media.
But the other thing that is kind of muddying the waters is people don't know the original source of their information anymore because they get it in push notifications or in, through social media or all these different ways where it's just kind of coming in front of them and they don't know, and frankly, probably aren't going to take the time to figure out, okay, where did this come from? Is that a credible source? Who passed this to me? What might their agenda be? Who's in this story? People aren't looking for that, and we're also consuming our news in our social media, the same place we're consuming baby pictures and food info, and all of the information of our life comes to us at once, and so our guard is down.
So how can you as a news consumer figure out if what you're reading has been attributed correctly? First, be critical of what you are reading or watching. Look into the sources journalists are using. Question what could motivate a source to say certain things. Next, check out the publication's guidelines on attribution. For example, the Washington Post, which was in hot water during Watergate for using multiple anonymous sources, has specific rules for attribution. While it's the journalist's job to hold those with power accountable, it's the consumer's job to make sure they do. And if they don't, pick up the phone and tell them. Kate Houston, Oregon News.
Now, speaking of attributing sources, what if high-level credible sources don't want their names attached to a story and want to be left behind closed doors? Lena Bond and I talk about the role of anonymous sources.
As journalists, it's our job to inform you.
And our reports are supposed to be fair and truthful.
But how can you be so sure that what you're seeing and reading is worthy of your trust, especially when we can't tell you where we got our information from?
We hear it all the time.
Well, Anderson, tonight, multiple sources.
CNN sources. Anonymous sources are saying a lot these days. President Donald Trump is not happy with reports based on leaks about White House business. For example, he recently tweeted, "Whenever you see the words sources say in fake news media and they don't mention names, it's very possible that those sources don't exist, but they're made up by fake news writers. Hashtag fake news is the enemy." Even if he's wrong and the information provided by so-called anonymous sources are correct, this is a risky practice. Journalists who use unnamed sources are asking you to trust them. These sources can be crucial to breaking big stories. CBS NewsPath correspondent Don Champion says he knows how important an unnamed source can be.
I mean, it's a natural part of a journalist's job. I think I really learned the art of sources when I worked in Denver, which was a very competitive market.
Anonymous information has fueled many major stories, even if the information is not immediately used. For example, Champion cites the allegations about Trump campaign connections to Russia.
A lot of the news organizations, we had that last summer, but no one would corroborate, confirm it, or confirm details involved in it. So for us, it would have been reckless to report that because no one was confirming it. Something that damning, we would have had high-level confirmation of it.
The Washington Post did publish that information. Let's see how they did that. The Post waited until they could confirm a source. Then, reporters wrote a story begging the question, who is source D? The Post doesn't have a specific unnamed source count. However, when concealing identities, reporters must reveal the reason why the source is unnamed. If the source is a U.S. intelligence agent, the Post doesn't disclose names unless, quote, under highly unusual circumstances, which must be weighed by the senior editors. But it's not just the mainstream media using unnamed sources. Social media platforms have been plagued by stories and claims that have no basis in fact and no named sources. Yeah, real fake news. So what can you do to avoid getting burned? Don Champion advises you to take matters into your own hands.
Stick to reliable, trusted major sources of news. Do your own research. Go on government websites and go to trusted sites and do your own digging on stories if you're suspicious about some information or things of that nature.
Lena Bond,
Deuce Woodson,
Oregon News.
All in all, there are methods to get good news. First, just know that news is not supposed to play into your biases. It's supposed to inform you objectively. Second, in today's day and age, everyone can report on anything, but that doesn't mean corners aren't cut. It's up to you to make sure that the facts you're getting are indeed facts. Lastly, just know everyone has an agenda. So being aware of those agendas going into reading whatever or view whatever you want to view can help sort out the good from the bad. Well, that's all we have here today for Oregon News. Hope we gave you the tools needed to get through good and bad news. I'm Deuce Woodson. Have a good day.